Here's Alex O'Connor to ask a physicist and an astronomer about the Big Bang.
If the universe did have a beginning, if we did know that it did have a beginning, right? Either the beginning of universal inflation or, there is a Big Bang singularity or something. If it did begin to exist out of nothing, do you think it needs a cause?
Well, if time itself began at the Big Bang, then there was never nothing for the beginning to come out of. The only sense in which the universe began out of nothing is that it didn't begin out of anything. It began in the same sense as a yardstick begins at its first inch.
Personally, my opinion is no. We certainly can't demand that it must have a cause.
Okay.
If there was a time when the universe did not exist, followed by a time when it does, then I could understand wanting to know what caused that change. But the universe is the space-time continuum, so by definition, whenever there is time, there is a universe. If time began at the Big Bang, then there was no time when the universe did not exist, therefore there was no such change. If there was no such change, then obviously there is no change to explain. There's no need for a cause of a change that never occurred.
Let's just unpack what we mean by a universe from nothing here, because there's different notions of that.
Yep.
So one you mentioned was it was coming from a quantum fluctuation of the vacuum.
Yeah.
And it's an older idea of a universe from nothing that goes back to Edward Tryon. And when people sort of make criticisms of the idea of a universe from nothing, they say,
that's not nothing.
That's not nothing, because that's a vacuum. And Neil Ash talked about the vacuum is not nothing.
Vacuums can't be
It's got all kinds of activity in it.
A vacuum is empty space, and space is not nothing.
But what Vilenkin suggests is something quite different. Here the idea is, well, what if we treat space-time or space itself quantum mechanically? Then his idea is that space itself would fluctuate into existence. So it's not coming from a vacuum.
Fluctuate into existence, I think, also paints the wrong picture. It makes it sound like existence exists first, and then the universe fluctuates into it. It implies that there was a time prior to the universe's existence, which, since the universe is the space-time continuum, doesn't make any sense.
So where's it coming from?
In his view, it's coming from a state with no space.
What is a state with no space? Is that a time without space? Could there be a time without space? Even if there could be, that still wouldn't be a time without a universe, because by definition, there is no time without a universe.
Okay, so just to be clear, when I say nothing, I'm talking about, like, as Aristotle said, what rocks dream of. I'm talking about what you see out of your elbow. I'm talking about nothing, right? And it like, even to say from nothing, the way that I've pictured that in my head is I imagine sort of darkness and then something pops into existence. But no, there's no space, there's no extension, there's no anything.
There's no there at all. When you say from nothing, you're still picturing a change, a difference between one point in time and a later point in time. If you're thinking about absolute nothing, there is no time either. If there is no time, there is no change. The only sense in which the universe came from nothing is in the sense that it didn't come at all.
But that's right. In Vilenkin's model, there is no space. The way you can think of it, you've been involved in philosophy of religion, Alex, and you'll be familiar with the idea that God created the universe ex nihilo, no materials. So that's what we're talking about here. It's exactly analogous. The universe is created ex nihilo, nothing material that we know of.
Again, that could only be true in the sense that it wasn't created at all. To say that the universe was created makes it seem like there was a time when it didn't already exist, followed by a time when it does. By definition, there was never a time when the universe didn't exist, even if it didn't exist for infinite time.
Nothing like anything you can see in this room, not even a vacuum. So no space.
So Phil, why aren't you worried? If you think things can begin to exist without causes, then why aren't you worried, as the common line of argumentation goes, that a deer has just spontaneously begun to exist in your kitchen and is currently destroying it? Shouldn't you go and check?
That's not analogous, because that would be a change. A change is a difference in a state of affairs between one point in time and a following point in time. In this scenario, there's a point in time in which there is a kitchen with no deer, followed by a point in time in which there is a deer in the kitchen. That's a change, and one would expect it to have a cause. But if time began at the Big Bang, then there was no point in time in which there was no universe, followed by a point in time in which there is a universe. No such change occurred, and changes that don't occur obviously don't need causes.
Well, I asked Vilenkin this. I sat in his office and I asked him, I said, why can't a tiger just appear in this room? And actually, he said to me, well, tiger could appear in this room. There's a quantum probability of that happening.
Yeah, that is true.
Right? But it's just unimaginably unlikely, so no need to worry about it.
But that wouldn't be out of nothing, right? That would be out of the...
No, that wouldn't be out of nothing.
So why aren't you worried that a tiger might pop into existence out of nothing? Not as a really unlikely quantum fluctuation of atoms or whatever, but out of just like nothing. There's no space, there's no nothing. It just a tiger just appears. Why aren't you worried that that's going to happen right now?
Well, we're not in nothing. So if it can come out of nothing, well, that's not where we are.
Right. That would not be analogous to the beginning of the universe.
We're in this universe, so it has to play by the rules of this universe. Now, the question is, could a tiger appear out of nothing, like not empty space, sorry, just space?
Nothing, yeah.
Right? Well, what Vilenkin tried to do was to use inflation. Say, look, the probability of a universe coming out of nothing and actually lasting is incredibly small. But what he suggested, and this is why it's called tunneling from nothing, that it could tunnel to a state where it would then inflate and become a big universe. So if it was just a tiger with no inflating energy, then it would just go back into nothingness, as it were.
Well, even to say that it tunnels to a state implies that there was a time when it wasn't in that state, which, if time began at the Big Bang, would not have been the case.
Sure.
But so now let's go on to this issue of causality.
Yeah.
Right. So if the universe came from nothing, would it need a cause? Now, what I want to do is ask the question, well, let's suppose God created the universe. Does God need a cause? Right? And the reply is often, well, God doesn't need a cause because God doesn't have a beginning. It's
God
only
necessarily exists.
God doesn't have a beginning. It's only things that have a beginnings need causes.
Yeah, that's how the Kalam.
Okay, yeah. So that's in the Kalam argument.
Folks who use the Kalam argument have very weird ideas about what a beginning is. If the universe had to have a beginning because it hasn't existed for infinite time because there hasn't been infinite time, then in that sense, God had a beginning too. If there hasn't been infinite time, then God also has not existed for infinite time. But the folks who use the Kalam argument insist that God doesn't have a beginning even if time does, which I don't think makes any sense. It seems to me that the only things that don't have beginnings are either things that don't exist or things that have existed for infinite time. If it's the case that there hasn't been infinite time, then everything has to have a beginning, even God, if he exists.
Now, that's not the statement that God exists eternally into the past, right? But rather the claim is that God exists timelessly and then enters into time.
Which doesn't make any sense, because to say "and then" implies temporality. It makes it sound like God exists before time and then exists within time. This is a contradiction because before is a temporal orientation and therefore cannot be independent of time.
But now let's go back to Nietzsche's holographic cosmology model. That also exists timelessly and then enters into time.
That also doesn't make any sense. I have to infer that this is just a poor way of describing it.
And we might make an argument for the Hartle-Hawking model, which also has a timeless state.
I wish I knew what this meant, because a timeless state, by definition, is one that never exists.
So here, maybe, then we could say exactly the same thing, where it doesn't need a cause, right? So the question is like we said about water being emergent, causality may be emergent. So then when we get to the quantum realm, maybe causality doesn't exist. That causality is a feature of our macroscopic universe.
Certainly determinism seems to be an exclusively macroscopic phenomenon, and even macroscopically it doesn't always seem to apply.
So we can't assert that these things must have causes because we don't know if causality is fundamental.
Yeah, this is kind of like a version of when people say, well, the universe needs a cause and that cause must be God. There's some kind of first cause or some kind of necessary existence. And a very common response to this from atheists is to say, well, in some sense, the universe can serve that role.
Yeah, why can't the universe itself be the first cause?
Right, the universe is this brute fact. The universe necessarily exists. People come along and say, no, the universe doesn't necessarily exist. It had a beginning. How do we know that? Hilbert's Hotel, the Big Bang. We've gotten rid of those ideas, right? So let's say that we can no longer dismiss the idea that the universe is this fundamental thing, which sort of, from which everything else stems. And all of the qualities that exempt God, I think legitimately, by the way, philosophically, I don't think it's a cop-out to say, oh, God doesn't need a cause. I think that's perfectly philosophically legitimate. What we're saying now is it might be equally legitimate to apply that to the universe or whatever sort of was the Big Bang or before the Big Bang.
If there was a time before the Big Bang, then by definition the universe existed before the Big Bang.
Here's the question, and this might be a question for you, Naish, because you've got this holographic view of time. And earlier, this is what I was trying to wrap my head around. Time doesn't exist, and then it does exist.
Well, obviously there was never a time when time didn't exist, so it would be a contradiction to say that time doesn't exist and then time does exist. That makes it sound like there was a time when time didn't exist followed by a time when it does.
Here's what the theists say, and here's what I say when I'm on my sort of theist day on. I say, okay, So we've got this timeless cause, but we've got a temporal effect. Right? The universe, which has popped into existence, it has time. It's got a temporal effect. But the cause is existing timelessly. In a sense, it sort of exists, you might want to say infinitely, maybe not eternally, but definitely timelessly.
Timelessly.
To say that something exists timelessly sounds like it exists without ever existing, which doesn't make any sense.
Here's the problem, right? If you've got a timeless cause that just exists timelessly forever, there's no like beginning to it, it just exists.
You said forever, so that doesn't mean timeless.
Forever means the opposite of timeless. It means it exists for infinite time.
Exists outside of time. There's no point in time at which it doesn't exist.
That's also the opposite of timeless. If something exists timelessly, that would mean that it does not exist at any point in time.
Let's say that, right? If there's no point in time at which this cause doesn't exist, if that cause is causally sufficient to bring about an effect, imagine it's like it entails the effect. Imagine the cause entails the effect. If you've got a cause which has the ability to bring out an effect, and that cause exists, there's no point in time at which that cause doesn't exist, then since that cause brings about the effect, there should be no point at which that effect doesn't exist.
I think what Alex is trying to say is that if the cause of the universe didn't begin at the Big Bang, why did its effect begin at the Big Bang?
Because the cause brings about the effect, the cause is timeless, so the effect should be timeless too. In order to have a timeless cause that yet brings about an effect at a point in time, that cause needs to like do something. It needs to have, in other words, as the theist would say, a will, or it needs to have some kind, it can't just be this inert law, because laws apply all the time.
Apologists often argue that God must be a person because they think that only persons have the free will to create something without that act of creation having a prior cause. Everything persons do seems to be causally determined, and there are things which are not persons, especially at the quantum level, that seem not to need a cause.
Right, laws don't sort of change, fluctuate. So you've got this no point in time at which the cause doesn't exist, there should be no point in time at which the effect doesn't exist. But if there is a point where the effect doesn't exist, but no point at which the cause doesn't exist, the cause must do something, must have some kind of will. We're looking at something that looks a bit more like God than some foundational law of the universe, right? You get what I'm saying?
I would if things with wills were the only things that ever do anything. Why would the cause of the universe, if it had one, need to be conscious or have a will any more than the cause of anything else?
It seems to me that it's kind of getting more complicated than it should be. I mean, I guess that this timeless story, maybe we misstated it. I guess it's timeless in the sense that in this earlier state, there is no time. There's only a space.
Saying that there was no time when there was only space is the same as saying that there was never only space.
But you could also say that it exists at one time. So it's not that it exists all the time. So this initial state, this three-dimensional timeless state, it's not that it exists eternally. It just was there. That's a proper way of understanding the universe.
I think it's clearer to say that the universe only began at the Big Bang in the same sense as a yardstick begins at its first inch. It doesn't pop into existence at its first inch, nor is it caused to exist at its first inch.
At early times. Now, here's the thing. It's not that there is one or the other, right? So I think you're kind of separating the cause from the effect. And I think maybe in a kind of roundabout way, I kind of agree with you, because this idea of holography is not that one is real or the other is not real. So the idea is that there are two different descriptions. Okay, there is one description with time, and there's another description without time, and they are equivalent description. There's not one, neither of them is higher or better or different from the other. They are the same descriptions.
The only sense in which I could understand a description without time is if that description simply doesn't need to take time into account because it's not describing something that ever changes.
It's just easier to kind of put it in human language or mathematical language in some situations. One is easier in one situation, the other is easier in other situations. But nonetheless, they're equivalent. Okay. So in that sense, I think I agree with you that if you want to say one of these is the cause, the timeless one is the cause, and timeful one is the effect, then they're in fact the same things. So we are the God. Is that right?
I'm not sure what that means, but it sounds an awful lot like the universe itself is the first cause, or the unmoved mover. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.